Good morning. I am really thrilled to be the first external speaker at this annual Barsan Research Symposium. It's really quite an honor. And I always like talking to what's mainly an emergency medicine research audience. Now, looking out there, I think there are residents in the room. Is this true? How many of you are residents? Sitting in the back, of course. Okay. All right. So then other than that, it's junior faculty and not so junior faculty? All right. So I was encouraged to create a talk that describes some of the highlights of my research, but also a little bit about my career and gave some inspiration to young researchers. And I'm like, thank you, Rebecca. This is a lovely assignment. So this is what I've come up with. So I have no financial conflicts, and I've been showing this slide for quite some time because these two beautiful young women are the reason why I have no finances of any kind to disclose. But I do have these two beautiful, intelligent, and very well-educated daughters. But as you can see, the youngest graduated several years ago, so I had hopes that maybe I would start to develop some finances. But then Kristen got married, and Lauren just got engaged, so I'm at no risk of developing anything, any sort of financial resources that I will have to disclose anytime soon. I've been fortunate to be funded by several different sources, and I think this is the nature of being an emergency physician health services researcher, that I have dipped into many pots of funding, and I think this is one of the things that I try to teach my trainees. They have to be creative and flexible in thinking about what kinds of sources would like to fund the kind of work they would like to do. And I belong to a lot of organizations, and I'm not speaking for any of them today. I am speaking entirely as an individual. So there are some people in this room who will remember what it was like in emergency medicine 30 years ago. There was really nothing. When I, as a medical student, when the dean of my medical school found out that I was planning to go into emergency medicine, he called me in and tried to counsel me that I'd be throwing away my career because it wasn't a real specialty, it would never amount to anything, there was no academic future, and it was not what he envisioned for me. I don't know how he could have known me for 4 years and thought that he could talk me out of anything that I had decided to do, but I want to give you some context because I think people coming into emergency medicine today may still feel like it's new and it's not an entirely mainstream choice, but when I look at the progress that we have made and that now we have programs like yours and like mine that are completely credible research programs that are pulling NIH funding and doing important and interesting work, and it really has happened very quickly. So we have a lot to be proud of, and we very much need for all of you bright young people to continue to take this on to the next level. Because for me, the emergency department is the most interesting place in the healthcare system from which to study anything, right? Because we see everything that happens in the healthcare system. We see the people who fall through the cracks. We see all of the variations in quality. We see the people who don't have access. We see the impact of fragmentation and poor communication. And there is no more interesting place for a health services researcher than the emergency department. It is the best place from which to study this very interesting healthcare system. My very first funded study was something called EMPATH. There's probably 2 people in the room who've ever heard of EMPATH, right? We were talking about acronyms, emergency medicine patients, access to healthcare. It's very important for those of you who want to be funded researchers, it's very important to have good acronyms for your studies, right? You need titles that are meaningful and memorable. I learned this early, so EMPATH was my very first funded study where I was the PI, funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And I was looking at the relationship between emergency department utilization and access to primary care. We collected data in 28 emergency departments across the country. It was really quite crazy to try to do that with the amount of money I actually had. But it really revealed something that I think is still true today, and I feel like I've been doing this study in some sense over and over again, and so have a dozen other health services researchers. So why do people come to the emergency department? Because we're always open, and everyone can come, and we do everything. And they don't have better choices. And sadly, this is as true today in many cases as it was 30 years ago. And so the use of the emergency department really reflects the lack of convenient and accessible alternatives. And this was a conclusion of empath now almost 20 years ago, that structural and operational changes in primary care practices will be required to decrease ED utilization. And we may be on the verge of seeing a real transformation of care delivery and care design that may actually, for the first time, start to impact emergency department utilization. So the traditional role of the emergency department then in giving emergency care and acute care really, I think, is about to change. The emergency department is a nodal decision point in the healthcare system. And if we actively embrace the coming changes, I think we can play a pivotal role in designing the new system, being the place where patients come to get rapidly worked up, thinking about creating alternative destinations from the emergency department, so it's not just out the door or upstairs. And I've seen this in my own system, that now I can admit them to observation, I can send them home with home care, I could send them home on home hospice. With some funding I got from CMS a few years ago, we created a transitional care program where I can send them directly to subacute rehab from my emergency department because I have the nurse and the social worker to do that. And so all of the people come to the emergency department. Our new job really is to sort them out and get them to the correct setting. And the only thing patients have really learned over the last decade is that if they're sick, you go to the emergency department and somebody will figure out how to help you. So it's an exciting time to be a health services researcher. I was at dinner with a few of the faculty last night, and I was saying that, you know, for a long time I've been studying the healthcare system, but now I get to do it. There are people who want to give you money to actually try new things and do demonstration projects because the system is really falling under its own weight and transformational change really is underway. So I'm going to talk about these three things, and I think I'm going to tell you some stories. I'm going to tell you one story that is about research and how one of my major sort of lines of inquiry came to be. Then I'll tell you a policy story, and then I'll talk a little bit about advocacy. And then I'm going to give you some reflections from the vantage point of somebody who's been doing this for a long time, and hope that you find something useful in that. So these are some of my current funded studies, and as you can see, like most emergency physicians, I'm interested in a lot of things, and my research has taken me to a lot of different places. But I want to talk about this one, which Bob mentioned in the introduction, the Community Voices Study, and tell you how this came to be, because I think it is, it's not what I started out to want to study, but now it's something that's consumed a good deal of my professional time for more than a decade, and sometimes stuff just happens. So the first thing that happened was there was PAD. So PAD was a public access defibrillation trial. This was an extravaganza, $8 million of NIH money, $4 million from device manufacturers, the Heart Association threw in some money. So we could answer this question is whether putting automated external defibrillators out into public places actually would impact survival from out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. I was a New York City site PI, and PAD was a really interesting study because what you recruited were places, facilities. In New York City, I recruited 49 high-rise residential buildings and 2 museums as the sites for the study. And then they were randomized to either get just somebody was trained to do CPR in the facility, and in the experimental group, people were trained to do CPR, and we gave them defibrillators, and then we waited for cardiac arrest to happen in the facilities that had been enrolled. This was a special study because it was one of the very first, one of the earliest funded trials under this new set of federal regulations that allowed research to be done when you couldn't get informed consent. Now, I know this audience knows all about EFIC. You have people here who are experts in this. I'm sure they've talked to you about it more than once. I don't see a lot of nods, Rob. You talk to about this stuff, right? But this is emergency research, for example, in cardiac arrest. Very hard to get written informed consent from someone who has just collapsed in cardiac arrest to participate in your research study. So there's a set of special regulations to do research when you can't get consent because of the nature of the condition. And there's lots of special things you have to do when you do this kind of research, and one of them is something called community consultation, and this is actually the language from the regulations, that you have to talk to representatives of the communities in which the research will be done and from which the participants will be drawn. Well, I can tell you when we started PAD in, I guess we were starting to prepare for it in like 1998. These regulations were new. Nobody knew what this meant. Nobody knew how to do community consultation. The federal guidance was not yet out. All we had literally was this sentence in the regulations. It was also a requirement to do public disclosure before and after the study. And so as a New York City site PI of PAD, I had to figure out how to do community consultation for this out-of-hospital cardiac arrest study. And I did what made sense to me. I talked to a few people. It's not what I would do now. I've learned a lot. But I got really interested in this idea of talking to the community about research. Who is the community? You know, the regulations talk about the community like it's an entity you can call them up on the phone and talk to. But when you're consulting with the community, who in the community do you talk to? How do you decide who that is? How do you find them? How much consultation do you have to do? How do you know when you've done enough? And how do IRBs use any of this to make decisions about this exception from informed consent? So after completing PAD, which I felt like once I had finished PAD, I could do anything, right? Because it was just one of those studies. I went back to NHLBI and wrote a grant and got some money to go back to talk to the people in those buildings in New York City who had been in PAD about what they thought about this idea of doing research without consent. And that was Community Voices 1, which really was the evaluation of what I had done in PAD. That actually led to Community Voices 2, where we tried to figure out the best ways to do community consultation and what were the metrics by which you would decide whether it had been appropriate and successful. And then that actually led to Community Voices 3, which is the current study, where we are actually using the tools that we created in Community Voices 2 to do an observational study of actual EFIC studies at 6 sites across the country. And so what really was sort of a question that was nagging at me at the end of PAD became more than a decade of NIH-funded research, and now I've apparently become something of an expert on this exception from informed consent. I've met with the FDA, and I'm invited to the NIH, and so the research actually has led me into policy making, and I think that's a natural connection with this sort of research. So that's my research story. Now I'm going to tell you a policy story. Though, as I say, they're not really separate things because often the research gives you the expertise that lets you participate in policy. So again, as, should I say Dr. Newmar? It's an informal kind of a shop here, right? So now I'm going to tell you a policy story. And quite a few years ago now, I was appointed to the New York City Board of Health. So this is a very interesting body. It is appointed by the mayor, but it's actually a statutory body, meaning that we actually make law. We are the only group who can amend the New York City Health Code. And so it has a long history, and initially it was sort of a bunch of political cronies who made terrible decisions because everything was based on economics rather than on the health of the people. So in the late 1800s, they reconfigured the whole thing and made it for doctors and scientists to do it, and then there was charter reform in 2000. This is where I came in. I wasn't with the earlier iterations of this. And it's 10 experts plus the Commissioner of Health in New York City, appointed by the mayor. You have to be approved by the city council, and I've 3 times sat through reconfirmation hearings, which are no joke. It's really funny because the board deals with some controversial things, and sometimes the city council people are playing to their audiences. But I've gotten to do some very interesting things on the New York City Board of Health. So the way this works is if the Department of Health wants a change in the law, they come to the board with a proposal, and we look at it and we think about it. We send it out for public comment. It then comes back to us, and then we make a decision about whether or not to change the law. And when I first went on the board, one of the early things that the department came to us with, because they were starting to shift their focus to chronic diseases because those were now the major threats to public health, and they came to us with this idea of calorie counts on menus, right? I know you have some of this here in Michigan now. I love this. Who knew, right, that Starbucks muffin was 800 calories, right? So this is what they came to us with. They came to us saying, well, you know, the public really isn't good at guessing how many calories are things when they're eating out. And we know that the labeling that's put on things you buy in the grocery store actually has changed behavior about what people purchase. This is the federal laws about labeling foods that are for retail purchase. And there was one fast food chain, Subway, which actually had voluntarily started putting calorie counts on their menus. They had done this before there was a law anywhere in the country. And this had been studied a little bit. Do people actually look at it? Did it actually alter what they purchased? And in fact, restaurants with standardized portions, which are all the fast food chains, you actually could go online to their website and look up the calorie counts, you know, for the Big Mac or, you know, the Pizza Hut pizza. So they had this nutritional information. It was buried somewhere where it was hard to find. And so the proposal was, let's put this information in front of the public at the time that they're purchasing the food, because maybe this will alter behavior to make for them to make healthier choices, and this could be a way to help decrease obesity. So after a lot of back and forth, the board did approve this change in the New York City Health Code, and we were immediately sued by the restaurant industry. And actually, I've been on the board for 10 years. I've been sued 5 times now by the restaurant industry. They do not like to be regulated. And so the first law, which had been written, actually got overturned sort of on a technicality, but the judge really pointed the way for how you could rework it. So we restructured the law and passed it again and got sued again. And this time we won in court. And so it only applies to fast food restaurants, and this is defined by things that have changed with standardized portions and so on. And we continued to monitor this to see if it made a difference. And so the first thing that happened, of course, was kind of sticker shock, that people were seeing how many calories were actually in these foods that they had been scarfing up. And the restaurants, when they saw people actually looking at the calorie counts and seeing no healthy choices, they actually changed what was on their menus. And so this was really the unintended happy consequence. When we looked at this 5 years later, the average calorie counts on these menus had actually gone down. The restaurants had started to develop healthier choices and lower calorie options just because the calorie counts were in front of the public. And so this is, I think, one of my favorite examples of how policy really can change behavior and improve health. I think this is a good use of the power that the board has. Not everybody agrees with this. There's been a lot of debates about the nanny state and, you know, there's too much interference. But I think changing the environment and giving people information, if that can help them make healthier choices, that's a really elegant way to improve health. So the board has done a lot of things. We did calorie counts, we banned trans fats. We recently did salt warning, so there's now a little salt shaker in anything that has, in a single serving, more than the recommended daily dose of sodium. We did restaurant letter grades, all kinds of fun things that I've had a chance to be involved in policy making as a result of being in on the New York City Board of Health. And what I learned is that when you're making policy, it's not just about the health outcomes. It's a very political space. There are lots of competing agendas. There are legal issues to be considered. There are financial issues to be considered. And so as a researcher, I feel like if we have the evidence, that we have the data, and it makes sense, then you should do it. But it's really not that easy once you leave the research arena and step into the real world of policy. I think having data helps. I think data can drive policy, but it's not the only thing that drives policy. And this, I guess, is what I've learned sitting on the New York City Board of Health. I had the opportunity when the former commissioner of health in New York City left to become the director of the CDC. He sort of took me with him, and now I sit on the advisory committee to the director of the CDC, and I get to see how this policy making plays out at the national level. And I think this is one of the great rewards of an academic career, that you do get these opportunities to do things and participate in things that are really important beyond your everyday job of taking care of patients and adding to the evidence about how to improve health. So that's my policy story. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about advocacy. And again, just as policy is related to research, advocacy, I think, is related to policy, because what you can do then is take whatever it is you're passionate about, whatever is the change you would like to see in the world, and you can use your research to drive policy, to advocate for the changes that you think are important. And so this is, I think, because you have special expertise, because of your training. You have special knowledge because you know the literature about how things actually affect health outcomes. You have special credibility. When you go, how many of you have ever testified in front of a legislative body? Local, Congress, and you see a lot of the people who've been doing this for a while have done that. Because you go with a certain authority and a certain credibility that gives you a voice, and you can use that voice to move forward the things that you think are important. It's important to go with data, and you should also go with stories, because what I've learned is that while some people like data, everybody likes stories. And the very first time I testified before Congress, I had a lot of data and information about, it was about the effect of the crack epidemic on gun violence. And it's where I first met Arthur Kellerman, who was also testifying before the same congressional panel. We had not met before, and we said almost exactly the same things coming from Tennessee and New York City about how these things were related. And I had a lot of statistics and stuff, but the questions I got from the panel really wanted me to tell stories about patients I had seen in the emergency department. And so you can be so effective when you decide to step into the advocacy arena. I think we have a special role to play. And so you get to exercise influence in all these different places. You know, here I'm speaking on a panel at the National Institutes for Health. And here I'm speaking at a community event against gun violence. And here I had just spoken to these fourth graders. They had interviewed me as one of their classes to understand what it was I did for a living. All of these ways that you get to exercise, influence, and practice advocacy. So for me, much of my professional and personal energy has really been focused on social justice issues, and in health, that really means health disparities and health care disparities. And this has become, I would say, something that takes at least as much of my time as my research. There are health disparities which really are embedded in social determinants of health. And these are, I don't want to say intractable, but very difficult challenges that we face as a society. But the health care disparities really are a product of the system in which we work, and this is where I really think we all have an opportunity to make a huge difference if we focus our energies, and we can use our research to drive this, we can press policy levers to drive this, and we can advocate for our patients as individuals. So over the last decade, the conversation has changed from disparities to talking about equity. And I saw this graphic a couple of years ago, and I just love it because I think it expresses what is often so hard to explain. You often meet people, and maybe even some people in this room, who are very proud of saying, well, I treat everybody the same. I'm not prejudiced. I treat everybody exactly the same. Well, think of this from the perspective of being the one who hands out the boxes. If you treat everybody the same, you give some people something they don't need, and you leave other people with still not being able to access whatever it is that they're trying to do. So this is equality, treating everybody the same. This is equity, where you're focused on having everybody attain the same level. And you distribute the resources based on where people are starting from and what they need to be able to achieve whatever the desired level is. And so treating everybody the same it really is not going to get us where we need to be. And unfortunately, this is actually the reality, that some people have a huge excess of the resources they need, and some people aren't even starting from the same starting point. So achieving health equity, both by eliminating health disparities and eliminating health care disparities, has really occupied a lot of my time over the last, I would say, 5 or 6 years. And this has really been the focus of much of my advocacy. And it has, of course, colored my research. I have done a number of projects on health care disparities, which really are looking at interventions that help us make sure that we are delivering care in such a way that everybody achieves the same outcomes. We've made a lot of progress. Now I think we're in a time when many of the advances of recent years are at risk, and I think it's important to not be paralyzed. I think we have to focus on what we can do rather than on what we cannot do. I think we have to be creative and collaborative about how to do that in the current era, and wait for a time when perhaps, at least for me, the values of our federal government will be more closely aligned with my own values. I figure at this state I can make political statements or whatever, right? What are you going to do? Never invite me back? But I do think it's important to think about what you can do rather than focusing on what you can't do. I think things are going to get worse before they get better. But I think if we do the work, they will get better. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about I guess, what it is, I think it's useful for young faculty members or residents or fellows who are just starting their research careers to know about how to do this. And I think the stories I've told you tell you a lot about why you should do it. It's an incredible privilege to be able to do work that is meaningful, that is important, that has impact, that actually changes the way people are cared for, changes the outcomes that they have. And so what does that really take? I'm often asked to talk about building an academic career. And I usually talk about the, sort of the three circles of patient care and education and research. And you can build an academic career focused on any of them. But by far the most interesting place to focus your career, if you're going to do academics, is on research. So what does it really take to build a research career? And for me, it's really, there's sort of two pieces to this. And the first thing I want to say is it's really important to learn to collaborate. Research is a team sport. It is not a solitary pursuit. And whether or not you realize it, as physicians, we are trained in a very competitive model. And if you're going to be a researcher, you have to break through that training to actually learn to collaborate, to learn to listen, to learn to value other people's opinions as much as you value your own opinions, because you will never be able to solve complex problems by yourself. My very first experience in a research team, and this was right after I had completed my health services research fellowship, I was fortunate to be working with a lot of non-physicians. It was an asthma project. I was trying to understand why asthma was the #1 reason patients came to the Harlem Hospital Emergency Department. This is a chronic disease. Why aren't they in clinic? Why are they in my emergency department? And I was working with a pulmonologist who was the only other physician. And then I had a team of people from the Columbia School of Public Health. I had a sociologist, a demographer, an epidemiologist, a health psychologist, and very smart people with all of these tools that I didn't know anything about, and who actually knew how to collaborate with each other. And they taught me how to collaborate, not something I'm sure I could have learned in a group of physicians. And I think it has allowed me to tackle problems where the tools that I bring as a physician and a very quantitatively trained researcher really aren't very useful. And it's allowed me to look at things like exception from informed consent, which is a lot of mixed methods and qualitative stuff that I was never trained to do, but realized I had to do if I wanted to understand this problem. So learning to collaborate outside your discipline with other specialties, with other kinds of scientists, it's very important. And I think nothing will help you more than learning to collaborate, unless it's the second one, which is mentorship. And I know this is in every talk about building a career, but the model that I had to use for myself, and the model that I now use for the many trainees whose research careers I am guiding, is not the traditional model of a single mentor who is sort of everything to you. I think it's really hard to find that kind of mentor. And you will need lots of different kinds of mentoring as a young researcher, and you may get different things from different people. I never found all of these things in a single person, but I was able to find a number of people who gave me various kinds of things that I needed. And so you need a career mentor who really helps you sort of think big picture strategically, what should you be doing? You need content mentors on whatever your area of research is, people who are truly clinical experts in that area. You need methodologic mentors who may not know anything about the content area, but they understand whatever those tools are that you're going to need to look at the questions. And then really personal mentorship, somebody to really help you with you know, the work-life balance stuff and all of the things from your outside life that affect your professional life and how you make all of those things work. And I think it's really hard to find all of these things in one person, but you will need all of these things to support you as you pursue your career. I was asked to sort of give this, you know, what are the keys to success? And I was asked, what's the one most important thing? Well, it isn't one thing. I think there are several things that are important. Formal research training is number one. I don't think it is realistic to embark upon a research career now unless you have formal research training. That generally is going to mean a research degree. I don't have a research degree. I don't think you can do it that way anymore. I did a lot of on-the-job training. My fellowship did not offer a degree, but I don't think that people can do it anymore. The people who hand out grant awards want to see that you have the credentials to do the work right. This is hard. I know there's medical school, and then there's residency, and then it's like, oh my goodness, now they want me to do a fellowship and go back to school. But you will learn the things that you need to know, and then you will be positioned to do the things that you want to do. And then there's this one, serendipity, and do not underestimate the importance of luck in your career. You don't want to depend on it, but it will happen. You can't really arrange for it, but you do have to be prepared to step up when lucky things happen and things fall in your lap. I was telling this story at dinner last night during my fellowship. We had a panel of sort of luminaries in health services research that came to talk to us about, you know, how they had launched their careers and tell their stories, as it were. And I'm sitting there as a fellow, and I'm thinking, now I'm going to find out how they did it. This is what I need to know. And one after another, they told these stories where at a critical point in their career, something just fell into their laps that changed their trajectory. In one case, it's like somebody's mentor died and they inherited his grant. Somebody, you know, it was like one thing after, it's like, so I should kill my mentor? Like, how does this, how do I operationalize this information I'm hearing in these stories? And I thought it was so unhelpful because it sounded like, unless it was some wild stroke of luck that would like be your big break, you would never really be able to build a career. It was very unsatisfying. But as time went on, I began to see that actually these strokes of serendipity occurred to everyone. Some of them happened to me, but you have to be prepared to recognize it, step up, and make it work when the opportunity is offered to you. So there is a certain amount of luck, but it's your response to the lucky breaks you get that I think will make the difference between whether or not you actually succeed. So stay open to them, and when something falls in your lap, recognize it, step up, and then make it work. And then there's persistence. You just have to not give up. You have to be so resilient. You know, I often say this is a little bit like being an actor. You'll go on a lot of auditions and you won't get the parts. You know, when I have a young investigator and the first time they write a grant and it doesn't get funded, they're crushed. They work so hard. They poured their blood, sweat, and tears into it. I'm like, shake it off. Let's go. Let's revise it. You know, you can't get a hit unless you keep swinging. You have to be prepared to accept failure and move beyond it, learn from it, whether it's a grant application or that manuscript that they should have published in JAMA and they turned down, whatever it is. You really have to develop a thick skin and just keep going. Believe in yourself, believe in your work, and don't let obstacles that may arise stop you. If you agree to do something or you were told you have to do something, do it. You know, your reputation is so important in this field. You don't want to become known as somebody who is flaky, who people can't rely on, who doesn't, doesn't close things. So especially when you're young, whatever it is you're given to do it well, on time, or early, even better. And you know what happens then? You get something else to do, and something else to do. But those are the opportunities that will actually lead you to where you want to go. And it's really important to learn to set priorities. I say this all the time. You want to avoid high burden, low return activities. And now you're thinking, well, how do I know if it's high burden, low return? And the answer is your mentor will tell you. And this is why you really need the guidance of somebody who has been through it. There are some things that may seem to you would be a really good idea, and your mentor will say, no way, you're not doing that. It will be a black hole that will suck the life out of you. You cannot do that. Even if it's something you want to do, your mentor may tell you that. Or there may be something else that you're not very interested in. It's like, you have to do this, because this can lead to other things that'll be really important. You can't see it at your level, and this is why the guidance of mentors is so important. And my trainees have now learned this, and I get emails all the time from them. I mean, if they get any kind of invitation, the first thing is they forward it to me and say, what do you think? Because they realize that sometimes my judgment about what's a good idea is so different from theirs, and they want that input. So I think that's really important, because there's only 24 hours in a day. So you need to seek and take experienced advice. You do have to make decisions for yourself, but you do have to listen to the people who've been where you want to go. Now, sometimes you'll get conflicting advice, right? But you're used to that, right? You work in the emergency department, you have consultants who disagree with each other. You know, this is what you do. You take in all of the data, and then you make a decision about the best course of action. And so these are a couple of my favorite quotes. Really, chance does favor the prepared mind. It looks like a stroke of luck, but because you have the training and the skills and you're ready to step up and deliver, it could be your big break. And the other thing I've noticed is the harder you work, the luckier you get. And that really goes to the, if you say you're going to do it, and then you get another opportunity and another opportunity. And it's not sitting waiting for the luck to happen, it's doing the work. So here's a few final thoughts, and then I'd be happy to take questions, things that I have learned along the way. I think it's really important to tell the truth. Professionally, personally, your integrity is one of the most valuable assets you have. I unfortunately have had the experience of becoming aware of researchers, I don't want to say colleagues, because it's actually not anybody that I actually work with currently, who did not have high standards of integrity. And while I may only know about one single instance where what they presented publicly is not exactly what they did, I now ignore everything that comes out with their name on it. And some of these people have actually risen to significant promises in various fields. But once you know that about someone, that there's some basic dishonesty, it is just so damaging. So always tell the truth. Now, you do have the option to remain silent. You don't have to say every thought in your head. But you really have to, I think, pay a lot of attention to maintaining your integrity. And then this idea of writing your own script, I think this works both in your personal life and your professional life. In your personal life, you were born into a script, right? A life that your family had for you, a life that society might have defined for you based on that family into which you were born. And I think early on, it's important to realize that you don't have to live out that script. You can write your own script. If you don't like the way it's going, you can edit it and you can take the story in a different direction. You are in charge of your life. If you take that responsibility and own it, it's both incredibly freeing and incredibly scary, because it's really comfortable to do what people expected of you. But then you wind up living the life that somebody else planned. And in your professional life, it's the same thing. You know, you're not here, but you know, your chair, your department, your director may sort of have a vision for you of what they need you to do and where you fit in, and you can decide if is that really the role you want to play, is that who you want to be, or do you want to do something else? And sometimes if you're proactive, you can step up and make a course correction in the same institution, and sometimes you have to leave to find a place where there are people who support the story that you actually want to write for yourself. But this idea of taking control of your own story, I think, is very important. When I think about the life that I was born into and the life I'm living now, obviously I've been, you know, improvising my script for a long time. Now, I'm often reluctant to share this last one with people who are too junior because, you know, when my trainees use it on me, it's really a problem. But sometimes it really is easier to get forgiveness than to get permission. The caveat, though, is sometimes when you do things without permission, penance will be required. And so you have to take that into account when you act. But often in situations where there's a lot of resistance to doing anything, I mean, I actually am very big on trying to gain consensus. I think that's the way I like to work. It's the way I like to work in groups, whether it's a research group or a committee. I think building consensus is the best way usually to move people forward. But sometimes there are these situations where either there is a deadlock or there's so much resistance to doing anything that you will never get agreement on what to do. And so sometimes you just have to act and then take the heat that comes from having done it without all of the appropriate permissions. And as I say, you do have to be prepared for whatever the consequences of that may be. But sometimes this is the only course left to you, but it's really better if you don't use it too often. And for the very junior people, you know, if you become too high maintenance, you may just get jettisoned. So pick and choose wisely. And so I think often you can do so much more than you think you can do, but you really can't do it alone. You have to identify allies and mentors and collaborators and supporters. And they may be situational. It may be around a single issue or event or problem. Not everything has to be, you know, like a lifetime friendship, but you really do have to learn how to identify all of the people whose interests are aligned with yours in any given situation. And then you can get a lot further than if you just try to do it alone. And doing that analysis as to where do people's interests lie, who else would benefit from whatever it is you're trying to do and getting them on board. They may not be doing it for the reasons you're doing it. They may have their own reasons. But as long as you are on the same side at this time in this fight, enlist their support. And you'll get a lot further than you would be able to. And you just have to be willing to try things you haven't done before. You have to be willing to take risks. It means that sometimes you'll fail. But you didn't go into emergency medicine because you like to play it safe. So I think most of you have the wherewithal to do this. And you just have to not give up, no matter how difficult it seems. You just have to keep going. Sometimes, you know, the only way to get where you're going is through whatever it is that's in front of you. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to take questions. This is my email if any of you would like to contact me offline. I do want to do one commercial. As was mentioned, I have a NIH-funded research fellowship in emergency care research. It is a wonderful opportunity for people who want to build a career. It gives you salary support. It pays for a master's in clinical research. You get to work with wonderful colleagues and a robust infrastructure in beautiful New York City. And I hope that, particularly for the residents in the room, if you're considering research careers, you'll take a look at this. Unlike the K-12 programs, the K-12 programs generally recruited people who had already done a fellowship. This is a fellowship, and so I'm looking for graduating residents who want to build a research career. I was only half joking last night at dinner because I sat on the NHLBI study section that reviewed T32s. Oh boy, you know, each one of these is like 600 pages, and it's just lists of bio sketches and all the things, tables and tables. Very painful, but you know, after she got 6 K-12s funded by NHLBI, Jane Scott came to me and she said, Lynn, we need to put some people on this study section because I want all the people who wrote unsuccessful K-12s to turn them into T32 applications, and there are no emergency physicians on this study section, so I need for you to go on. Well, at that point in time, if Jane said, I need you to do this, like, yes, Jane, okay, all right, sign me up, okay. Sadly, there were no applications from emergency medicine until my last year on the study section. So I encourage those of you who are in a position to write training grants to think about that. But one of the things that they look at is not just who did you actually recruit into your program, but how many applications did you get? So what I need is for like every, you know, strong research place in emergency medicine, you have to get 2 residents to apply to my program. Even if they don't want to come, I just need for you to have 2 residents apply to my program. So it looks like I have the correct number of applications. And you can sort of send me a note. It's like, don't bother to read it, just trying to help with the application number or something. I'm only half joking. So think about it. Even if you're not sure you want to move to New York City, you know, you can apply and we can talk about it. But it's really important. There is now a second T32 in emergency medicine. Pittsburgh got funded just this year for a T32 in emergency care research. So you should apply to both of them, even if you're planning to stay in Ann Arbor, so that we can have a good showing of interested applicants. It's very important. So I'll stop there. And does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask me about anything? I assume we have time. We have a little time? Okay, Bill.
So at the end, when you have, so you have young people who want to be researchers, junior faculty, and I'm assuming that you probably wouldn't consider anybody to get into this seriously without some kind of postgraduate training.
That's right.
Well, once they've done that and you have them in there, I mean, is there a, you know, I think most people have or develop some kind of a method for how you do this. I know here they've been doing some things like with launch committees and stuff like that. I mean, do you have what's your process for trying to develop these junior faculty and, you know, get them to the point where they can get their promotion and tenure?
Yeah, launch, right. So I'm a big believer in being very explicit about expectations. And early on, I did this with the K-12 scholars, and I do this with the research fellows. We sit down and lay out a fairly detailed plan. Now, this has actually now been sort of incorporated into all the research training programs as this individual, you know, development plan, these IDPs that everybody wants you to write. But I think this really works, and this is a structured plan about the projects you will do, the meetings you will submit, you know, abstracts to, the grants you will write, the papers you will finish, with timelines. And as long as they're moving along on the timeline, I will support them. I can't guarantee that if you write a grant application that it will be funded, but I guarantee you if you don't write it, it won't be funded. And so you have to be moving along with the milestones we have agreed on. If there's a problem, if we have to renegotiate the timeline, it's better to do that before you've missed a deadline than after you've missed a deadline. But it's a very structured process, but it's completely individualized depending on the faculty members. So this actually takes a lot of time. And then my job is to make sure they have everything they need to succeed and meet those milestones, and their job is to do the work. And if I do my job and they do their job, then they will have my continued support. And what happens is they self-select. When you've been very clear with the expectations, it becomes clear to them that they're not doing their part. So when we get to the point, and this actually hasn't happened to me very often, where it's like, you know, maybe you need to rethink your trajectory. The most important thing is they must write. And the people I've had who fell off the timeline, it's because they didn't write. And so, you know, if you're a researcher, you're a professional writer. You know, you need to own that. And if you're not good at it, you need to learn it. Or you need to collaborate with somebody else who's really good at it, because you must write. You write for money. You write as part of your job. And so you have to embrace that. So it's a very structured plan. I have now faculty who I mentored on their Ks who now have multiple R01s and are getting promoted to professor. And this really is the pathway. They do the work. And I often say, you know, the way you build a research division like I have is you hire talented people and then they make you look good. But you have to give them the support. So if they do the work, we get there. If there's confusion about what the expectations are, or they get diverted into things that they think they should be doing that you're like, what do you mean you did that instead of this? I think that's where it goes wrong, but it takes a lot of time. Yeah.
Very nice presentation. One question I have is, how do you convince emergency physicians, you know, in this sort of day and age of skyrocketing housing costs, particularly in superstar cities like New York, of the value of a career in science? Because, you know, what you're saying is, gosh, you know, you went to medical school, you went to college, now you've done a residency, now some more wearing sackcloth for a few years. You could be having, you know, kids and so forth. How do you put all this together and sort of illustrate, you know, that there is a value in doing science? And it's not for everybody, but how do you convince people to do science?
Yeah, so first of all, I'd like to point out that all those people actually are really good at delayed gratification. So, you know, it's not like they don't understand the concept, but it's not so much that you convince them to do it. I look for people who have the fire, who have the passion, and then convince them that I can help them get there. I don't think you can talk people into it. Research is hard. You know, this is not for everyone, and you have to really want to do it. I think where we lose people is there are people who really want to do it, but they don't see how they can. They don't see how they can make it work. They don't see how they can support their families. They don't see how they can put off earning the money. But they have to want to do it. I don't think you can talk them into it, because they really do have to be internally motivated, almost driven. So I actually look for the fire. And then, you know, I sort of, you know, scoop them up and protect them and support them and bring them along. But you can't actually talk people into it. And when people are ambivalent, you know, they really have to make that choice. They have to commit to making the sacrifice. You know, the researchers in this room know I work more hours than any of my clinical faculty. They think I only work 8 hours a week because I only do 8 clinical hours, but I work 60 hours every week. This is harder. You have to want it, you have to love it, but you also need people to support you in it. So I don't try to talk people into anything, but I do show them how I can make it possible if it's what they really want. Thank you. Pleasure. And I'll be around until after lunch, so I look forward to hearing your presentations and seeing you.